Thank you. So I'm going to begin with the land acknowledgement statement. Before we begin, we acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of Lummi, Nuksak, Samish, and Semiahmoo people who have cared for and tended this land since time immemorial. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. And please join us in uncovering such truths at any and all public events. All right. So I'm going to make my screen bigger and call to order the Legal and Justice Subcommittee. It's October 10th, 2023 at 11:33. And what the main topic is for discussion is the Ann Deacon Center for Hope, the uses, and a survey. So this started off out at the Index Committee, and unfortunately Caleb wasn't able to make that meeting, but Wendy was there and Barry was there, and so this was kind of heavily discussed. There were other people too, not just the three of us, but on what we could do, and whether we needed to look at the Ann Deacon Center for Hope and keep it on track with what its intended uses for, or after doing a survey or two surveys, to determine if maybe it needs to be reevaluated and the service should be focused in different areas. But that's once we decide what we think we need to do with this, and it came back to the Legal and Justice Subcommittee. Wendy had the great idea of creating two surveys. She's a little bit cynical on saying, she goes, sometimes people don't respond well to these, but we could give it a shot. But I think we kind of really want to know who's using it, why they're using it, who's not using it, what the problems are, and how do we focus on those. And so Wendy came up with the first survey should actually be for the people that are working at the stabilization center, the people that got their feet and hands into it, and ask questions like, what would need to happen in order for you to accept a patient? What are the impediments you face within the system that may prevent acceptance of an individual? What systematic impediments do you have to allow drop-offs more frequently for its original purposes? So Mike Hilly was also involved. He said, it's just not feasible for us to use it right now. We're just going to use the hospital. He said that the drop-offs are too long. I know Perry has brought different things, the flyers and the statistics, and I mean, I think he's doing a fabulous job trying to get the word out to people, but we want to know why people aren't using it and what the problems are with it, so that we have better data to what we can do to fix it, or if we need to reevaluate how it's being used. The second survey, which would go out to EMS, communications, law enforcement, any first responders. As I spoke with Caleb earlier, that it might be best to do a more simple survey in you're putting in statements to agree or disagree with certain facts. So then we can determine, why are law enforcement using it? Have they used it? Do they know about the facility? How likely are they to use the facility themselves? How likely are they to refer somebody to the facility? And making sure that both of these surveys are anonymous, so that people can be honest and not worry about any backlash from anybody else. So that way I think we'll get a better or a more accurate response if they know that they don't have to say who they are. But I wanted to get feedback from everybody here to see what your thoughts are, what kind of questions we should put out there, what questions we shouldn't put out there, or if anybody thought that this was just a complete waste of time. 'Cause I'm open to anything. And I see Caleb is up and ready to start talking, so help me out, Caleb.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about this at the task force level at the last task force meeting, kind of wrapping up the index committee's notes on it. And I know Chief Tank has perspective on this as well. One of the things that came out of the task force meeting was that when it comes down to either law enforcement or EMS contacts, referrals to the Deacon Center for Hope is really challenging if it takes more time to have an admission. For example, if it takes them 35 minutes for admission in one location and it only takes 10 minutes in a different location, the folks from EMS and law enforcement are simply going to choose the quicker option, kind of depending on the outcomes. And I think that stands pretty much across the board in EMS and law enforcement. The thing that we were trying to work out as a result of the discussion at the full task force meeting was having an education process, kind of throughout the regional law enforcement and EMS services to say, hey, look, this is what can be done at the Deacon Center for Hope. Here's how. Perry came up with some small kind of business card size contact information and some of the services that are provided, and those things could be circulated to law enforcement, EMS in the region to give people a heads up. They can call in advance sometimes to check to see, hey, is this something that you would take? And that was tangential to the whole conversation about the survey, but it would be informative to have those discussions. In addition to those two surveys, it's important to recognize that we've had more than one public comment from Justin DeForest, who's saying that we really need to, it might be Jason, I'm sorry if I got the name wrong, but we really need to make sure that we're surveying the people who are coming out of the Deacon Center for Hope to make sure that the outcomes that they are experiencing are as clear as well. Not necessarily the same format in terms of how to get those surveys delivered, meaning they shouldn't come from the council because they have to be sort of inside the HIPAA requirements for folks who are in the center. But so those kinds of concepts need to be incorporated. And again, I'm looking at this from a standpoint of if somebody from law enforcement is actually interested in using the Deacon Center for Hope, what do they know? What do they not know? What questions would they have about educating the law enforcement EMS folks to, maybe to the point where they're actually using those services? So maybe it's more than one survey. I know my biggest concern is people aren't going to answer the surveys overall, is that, everybody's busy. It's just one more thing for folks to clear out of an inbox. So I would worry that people aren't going to answer the surveys. I have more, but I'll shut up.
Thank you. I think I saw Stephen and then Maya.
Thanks, Raylene. Just trying to respond a little bit with not a very deep knowledge to some of the points that have been made. I agree with Caleb and Jason, I'm pretty sure, Caleb DeForest, that surveying people coming out for effectiveness and having other measures of effectiveness, because that's something we promise to do and we don't very often do, would be a critical element of this. I think if I understood your introduction, Raylene, you were saying the conversation was going toward anonymity, so people couldn't be identified. Frankly, I think that would be a mistake. I think we want to know whether we're hearing a perspective of someone from the sheriff's office or EMS or an outlying PD, because I think that will inform how it's working for different entities that we want to have using it. I have a great deal of confidence in Perry, and I think he does many things exceptionally well, but I don't think this is an educational issue or an informational issue. I think people have enough information right now in their heads, whether it's accurate or not, and where it's coming from, we may not know, to know that it takes too long to process somebody there, so they're not using it. I assume that was Mike's reason for saying that. So we've got to change that. I mean, that differential has got to be changed so that they can see that it is useful for them in their terms, which is drop-off time, dead time, so to speak. And I think we're put in a hard spot because we don't have contractual control over the service providers there. So I don't know if a survey can get to that. I think that's sort of a separate task from surveying. I think getting survey information would be valuable, but I don't think we should delay making whatever changes we can there, which is having a side admissions function that people can drop off into or whatever. It's a little disappointing that we're at this point a year and a half in, and people are affirmatively choosing not to use it.
Thank you, Stephen. Maya, and then Tank.
Thanks. I don't think we need a survey to tell us what the problem is and why people aren't using it. And I guess maybe Perry can answer this. Like, why is the drop off so long that it's not usable to law enforcement? And could they at least just like drop people off and then leave them, and then staff there determines whether they can be admitted, and if they cannot, then they give them some services, or like return them. I don't know, what can be done at that service point? That's the problem, I guess. That doesn't really need a survey. It needs an answer from the people doing the work, or I guess.
To respond to that, Maya, at least one perspective, I think that one of the challenges has been, well, two probably, and the first one's pretty simple. If it's a combative client, the staff can't go hands-on, and so they call the police if an individual becomes physical, or presents a danger. I don't know how often that occurs. That has certainly occurred, but I don't know that that's the biggest barrier. I think the other barrier is that neither of the providers have any resources or funding to transport a client that is not appropriate for admission. And so historically, or up to this point in time, the providers have, it's sometimes used a taxi at their cost, and that sort of thing, but have essentially viewed the first responder as transportation for the individual if they're not admittable. And again, I think that was a lack of resources on the part of the providers, to be able to provide that, that transportation, et cetera. So one of the things that I'm doing in that regard, I think that folks are aware that we've had an addition to the Response Systems Division staff of a transport individual. We refer to the person as a behavioral health aide. His name's Colin. And so just recently, we have a van, we have a driver availability. And so I'm working with Melora and John Dukes, the supervisor, to make this individual available. Right now, he works 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. So it doesn't cover, obviously everything. But I certainly am working with the providers to say, listen, it's okay if the individual is not combative and you discover that he's not admissible for some reason or another, that we do have transportation to get him to wherever, that might happen to be other than the hospital, because, that requires typically ambulance and or some kind of medical transport. So those are the challenges, not that I'm trying to get all the answers necessarily, but those are the challenges that the providers have been experiencing relative to drop off, because I don't honestly think that law enforcement or the first responders can provide a lot of information, client information, at that point, as simply dropping the individual off. I have more information, but I'll stop there because it's not pertaining specifically to what I think the barriers are. Sorry, guys, I jumped out in front of some folks there.
No worries, it's appreciated, Perry. Thank you. I think Tank and then Caleb.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think we should look at is pre-screening prior to the officer dropping a person off. I know a couple months ago, one of my officers called down there. They gave as much information as they could, and the information was received, and the officer drove from Blaine down to the center, and the person was received. The information I received back from the officer, because I was curious about the length of time, and the length of time was not extraordinary as it has been in the past. So perhaps maybe taking a look at the pre-screening and information that officers and deputies can give prior to arrival. But also, one thing in terms of the usage, it really makes a difference if you have an officer coming from Bellingham versus an officer coming from Sumas or an officer coming from Blaine. The amount of officers that the smaller jurisdictions might have on duty is a factor as well. So if Everson has one or two officers, the likelihood that they're going to take that officer to Bellingham for a maybe is probably not likely. So I think that's an issue as well that the small cities and smaller jurisdictions deal with.
Thanks, Tank. Caleb?
And Chief Tick may be able to specifically speak to this, but there are restrictions for the circumstances for which a law enforcement officer can actually transport somebody in a vehicle. It is not simply a matter of saying, hey, do you need a ride? Let's go. You have to have some very specific parameters being met in order for them to be legal to transport. So, for example, if there's no crime being committed, there's nobody going anywhere. You can't simply just transport somebody for no crime. If they're voluntarily wanting to check them out in themselves into a service, there may be some leeway there. And again, Chief Tank can correct me here, but the thing that we have to be aware of is the law enforcement officers, specifically in our community, have in the back of their minds, am I legal to transport, which is not necessarily a component that we've kind of discussed here. So that may play a role, even a large role in this discussion.
Well, and then I would just add that there's always an inherent risk with transporting anyone. So, that's something that we do look at, but more so, I believe it's about the time commitment that Perry and others talked about earlier. So that's why I believe, that pre-screening might help and might be a good determination. Because clearly, I'll just give you an example. In Blaine, it's going to take, depending on traffic and weather, 35 minutes or 30 minutes to transport a person there. And then if you have to wait an hour or hour and a half or whatever that might be, then you also have to come back. So, you're taking a person off the streets for quite a bit of time. So, but yeah, like Caleb said, there is a risk, and we do have to weigh the risk with policy and the safety for everyone.
Thank you. So going back to what some of you have all said, Mike Hilliard said the drop-off times is the biggest thing. They have to be under 15 minutes. And he said, and the drop-off times during business hours, Monday through Friday, during the day, didn't seem to be as much of a problem as it did in the evening hours. So then going back to what Tank said, I guess I would have to ask Perry, is it possible to have a pre-screening form that's fillable, that could be sent out to law enforcement so that they would just have that available if they want to bring somebody in, they could fill out that form online, send it down, and somebody could review it and get back to them in a timely manner, or is that not an option?
It's a great question, Raylene, and actually we have a process set up at this point in time that I've included on law enforcement visor cards that we've distributed to all of the law enforcement offices in Whatcom County. That on one side, it just gives general information about, you know, the crisis stabilization center and et cetera. But on the other side, what it does is instructs that a first responder or law enforcement staff can call. And what we're really after is a couple of steps in the call. First of all, are there any beds available? Because we can make this a real short call with law enforcement. It's like, we don't have any beds available. And so that's the end of that. But the next step, once it's like, yes, we have beds available, just some really basic information that is asked, I believe, I want to say 4, it might be 5 questions that are asked of the officer. Just, you know, there's exclusionary aspects to this, and that's what those questions are about. And at the end of that phone call, and it sounds like possibly when Chief Tank was talking about that, the individual used that and he said, yes, bring them. So they've been through, we have a bed available. The individual is not on oxygen. The individual is not, you know, having a primary medical, you know, issue that they need to be taken to the hospital, et cetera. You know, again, those exclusionary questions. And at the end of that very short phone conversation, because the staff knows it's law enforcement, they say, bring them. And we then move into, from my perspective anyway, this other piece of the staff holding that it's not our client, this is our transportation. So will you stand by so that we can verify the information? And then if we are unable to admit them, you can take them with you. You know, that's the challenge that I'm working with right now relative to other available transportation, or even possibly, if that's not as available, creating a flex fund for the providers to be able to, you know, call a cab or something of that nature. But again, I didn't want to get into a whole lot of detail, but they don't need to fill out a form, but a phone call can be made, and they can ascertain whether a bed is available and the individual appears to not have any exclusionary criteria. For example, they can't admit if they have oxygen. The certification won't allow it. Oxygen, you have to have, you know, a certain level of certification with like a hospital and et cetera. Or if the individual is not able to carry out their own daily living, you know, activities, you know, kind of thing. So it's a super short set of questions, and it was exactly the purpose of what we're talking about now that we implemented that process.
Thanks, Perry. I'm gonna go back to you again with another question, because I like doing that. You mentioned that Colin is a behavioral health aide with a vehicle or a van that can transport people
That's correct.
during business hours currently.
Correct. He does have some, we're transporting individuals that are seeking services to Digwallic on Wednesday mornings, and there may be some other standing times that he won't be available, but that's not excessive at this point. But we, relatively new position, relatively new staff. And the intent is to be available for a direct phone call, that he has his cell phone with him. An individual, you know, requests transportation to an appointment that they have. And then he, you know, is able to provide that, et cetera. So indeed, that is now in place.
So he's the Ann Deacon Center for Hope Uber driver.
Well, not exclusively, but for the community in general, because there is a lot of need as far as vulnerable individuals not having transportation, but needing to get to an important appointment or meeting. And so it is I actually stepped in and began to communicate with my supervisor and et cetera in regard to that because of the need that we're describing today, in alleviating the necessity for first responders at all, to remain beyond just a couple of minutes. If it was maybe a EMS, by virtue of the fact that they have some vitals and they could provide that to the staff, that wouldn't be true, obviously, for a law enforcement officer, possibly breathalyzer. But beyond that, I doubt that they would have a lot of pertinent physical information for the, on the individual. So no need to remain.
So is that location restricted? I mean, is an officer that's out in Sumas going to be able to use that, or an officer in Blaine, or is it going to be more restricted to Bellingham and the just outskirts limited?
Yeah, great question. I have gotten a verbal, what do I call it? I've gotten a verbal support that we want to be able to use the van and behavioral health aid for transportation relative to the crisis stabilization center. But I don't think that it's limited. The same issue, obviously, if there was a significant amount of that kind of transportation going on, then it causes transportation, in other locations not to be available, kind of the same thing. But it hasn't been limited specifically at this point in time. We're definitely trying to understand, how to best use the resource and the needs, that exist. I think a second driver could be, as a matter of fact, possibly even more than that, just because of right now the limitations Monday through Friday, kind of 9 to 5. I think it's 8 to 4, 9 to 5 type thing.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I would love to see it expanded to evenings and weekends, as I know sometimes staffing is shorter for law enforcement, and especially in the rural communities, in the wee hours, and not sometimes when the crisis hits. But I see Stephen's hand up, so I'm gonna go over there.
Just wanted to say that I don't think I guess my sense of this is that this is really a super urgent kind of thing that we've been talking about already for 4 months. It doesn't seem to be a thing that we should be looking at a shared resource that may or may not be available there some hours, not others, or if they're not doing another important transport task or something, there ought to be a dedicated transport resource that is available on call. And I don't know that that's a person necessarily. Maybe it's a contract with multiple taxi companies so that they can serve outlying areas as well as urban areas, and they come when you call that they're needed. It shouldn't be so contingent, nor should it be contingent that maybe when they get there and they're invited to drop somebody off, they go through a process and they find out, whoops, no, they're not eligible, or whoops, no, somebody. I mean, we can't have these contingencies, because that all weighs on the first responders or the law enforcement drop off, and the more that doesn't work, the more reluctant they're going to be to use it anytime. I also hear that there's a potential problem if there's not a bed, and we don't have a bed at the jail, they're going to go to the hospital. But suppose there's a bed 3 hours later, wouldn't they be appropriate then? We don't have a process for transporting them to Andeacon from the hospital where we don't want them. So there are gaps all over this that we know exist, but we haven't thought of resolutions for. And I don't know. We seem to be way behind the curve on this, and I don't understand why.
Thank you, Stephen. And I appreciate the urgency on trying to make this work better and quicker. I see Jake is chiming in here.
Just real quick, sorry. Perry, is security involved at all over there? Is like we have the courthouse here. Is that something that's and if it is, I guess I'm just wondering, like, could they be utilized for transport? Like, you know, if officer needs someone, they come and pick them up. Would that reduce the, there might be liability written all over that. I get it, but could they be utilized as a resource and perhaps for transport and kind of being that middleman in this situation? I don't know.
Right. There is no security staff at the Crisis Stabilization Center at this point. They utilize, basically the doors are locked. They utilize an intercom system, and there's the person at the front counter can actually see the individual that's outside the door. And so that isn't an option. But to Stephen's point, at least in my thought process, developing a let me back up just a minute. I think that everybody is aware of the fact that the county does not have contracts nor pay for the services that are provided at the Crisis Stabilization Center. Those funds come from private insurance and Medicaid. So and the only component that we actually have is a lease agreement. We do lease the facility to Pioneer Human Services and Compass Health for a nominal rental cost, and also within that an agreement just in terms of providing services, as per RCW and WAC requirements. So that one isn't an option, but it seems to me that in addition to availability of transportation, as we were sort of talking about with the behavioral health aid, the need to do what we refer to as flex funding, but create a contract for transportation services, because it would probably be simpler to do that with the providers as opposed to, I don't know how many taxi companies there are, or whomever. But that way the payment could be made and it wouldn't be an impact to the provider to take on additional cost in the services. I think folks are aware that it's pretty thin line between them, basically covering cost. And so transportation, becomes a challenge. So that's at least my thought process about the best way to approach it at this point. So great point though, Jake.
Thanks. As he talks about that, I recall that the city of Redmond used to have a position. It was a transport officer, essentially. It was kind of like a reserve officer. They did have to go through some training. It was a limited commission, but it was basically to transport people to and from the jail, or to and from the hospital. And so they were trained in certain techniques, and because definitely there's a safety concern for anybody that's going to be transporting somebody that's in a crisis, and we want to limit that liability. I don't know if that's something we could look at as a contractual thing for this program. The other question I had, and I don't know who would be best to answer this, but I'm going to kind of look at Caleb, is, a lot of times individuals that are getting released from jail, we've talked about having a navigator to help them transition. But sometimes there's a lot of crisis when they're, okay, you're free to go now. And they're like, okay, I don't have a home to go to because now there's all these no contact orders. And I know I need to talk to an attorney, but I don't know where I'm going to go and I have no funding. Is the Ann Deacon Center for Hope an option for this? And maybe it's a question for Perry. I'm not sure. For
I would
people
say,
that are being released.
without looking at it, I would say no. But generally speaking, our reentry services are going to be the ones who are coordinating those types of releases. And as I mentioned in a previous meeting, I think it was Index or the whole task force, one major challenge is we never know exactly when somebody's going to get out. Sometimes we only get an hour's worth of notice, and sometimes they can be fairly complex. So I would say it's hard for me to imagine a situation where somebody would leave the jail and go directly to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope, unless I'm missing something. So correct me if I'm wrong on that, Perry.
There have been some arrangements, typically through a case manager, where an individual is released from the jail and taken to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope. It would be, at least so far in my experience, it's rare, but it absolutely occurs. Oftentimes, this is an individual that is leaving the jail and has an admission to SUD inpatient services, and we want to provide a stable, location for the individual because their admission is not available for a day or 2 or 3, something of that nature. So those are the situations in where I'll say a jail transfer, for lack of another term, has ended up occurring.
Thank you. Caleb?
I appreciate that clarification. As I'm thinking about this too, there are restrictions for people who are transporting for corrections every bit as much as there are for people who are in general authority law enforcement. So we have to be aware of what those restrictions are, and it's not going to be able to fit for all circumstances. Also, you mentioned the navigator position. It's been reworded to something that is now escaping me, but it's not called a navigator anymore, and is being contracted through Northwest Regional Council. There is the position allotted. I think that we are going for an additional amount of money for a supplemental for 2023 budget because it wasn't sufficient to cover the cost, but that has not been filled. So it's a contract position that we hopefully will have first quarter 2024 having that secured.
Thank you. And then I'm just gonna briefly ask Jake and Maya. Jake, because you deal with some individuals that are in crisis in the mental health section of probation, and Maya, because sometimes your individuals are lost when they get out of in custody and still need to talk to you. Do you think that would be an option that we should look at further for making sure these people have a smoother transition? And silent.
Potentially, yes, I could, I mean, I want to check with Denise and Deanna, but I think, certainly it could be helpful. How often? I don't know unless I look into it a little bit more.
Thank you.
Sorry, let me clarify your question. Are you suggesting this is a transition from jail to the community?
Yes.
Like as a re-entry kind of step for people?
I know that that's not exactly what the Ann Deacon Center for Hope was implemented, but I'm looking at it as an individual that was incarcerated, that still has pending charges, that is in now crisis. They don't know where to go. And you still need to talk to these people. You still need to help them. And if there's a little bit of a smoother transition, is that something that might be beneficial and that we should look at?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know that I don't want to be so elementary, but like, I don't know the basic criteria for entry, like so I can imagine a client who would be better off going to a crisis center than to the streets from jail for sure, but I don't know. I don't know how widely it would be used.
And this is me just thinking outside of the box and trying to make this work better for everybody. And I could be way out there and I have no problems with anybody telling me, no.
If someone was in the jail and experiencing mental health crisis, I think that the mental health staff at the jail would be responding to that and then asking for like a DCR to show up and do an evaluation. So I mean, I like to think they wouldn't. I don't know. That's sort of my gut.
Okay. Thanks, Maya. Perry?
Yeah, a couple of things, and I've talked in some other meetings just a little bit about this, just a point of clarification. The contract that Health and Community Services has with Lifeline Connections relative to providing services in the jail is actually misnamed in my opinion. I didn't name it, so it's referred to as a jail behavioral health and a reentry services. And I think it would be more aptly named as the jail crisis services and reentry, because the number of staff that are available, and now we do have a full complement of staff, are essentially have a prioritization of individuals in the jail that are experiencing crisis, and are specifically, we wrote out a priority of those individuals, that being individuals that have serious mental illness with psychotic features that are being prescribed by the jail prescriber, whether they're in compliance with that or not, because they are the most vulnerable individuals that are coming towards release. So we have kind of two sets of those, that criteria within 30 days of release, and to Caleb's point, we don't always know, and that criteria with a 60-day release, because at least we have a date of estimated release that doesn't always fit. And I think that a lot of times folks don't understand that that is the services that we're able to provide at this point. So but I want to add to that the reentry aspect is certainly not limited to those individuals. An individual certainly that is leaving and somebody is, and the team has identified that they need some resources, the reentry person will work with, an individual, but we are prioritizing the most vulnerable individuals leaving to make sure that we're not missing that individual if at all possible, and making certain that there's navigation through the reentry individual and a plan put in place, and etc. There are many more individuals that I would describe as experiencing behavioral health issues that don't meet that criteria, that are not being provided services because there are too many at this point in time. So I want to make that clarification first of all. And but I would also say that I think that that is something that we're working towards. I've been really pleased to continue to work with Lake Whatcom Center, who has received a grant. And folks may have heard about this. That is the HEART program. Wish I could tell you what the acronym stood for, but I can't. But more specifically, they have a federal grant through SAMHSA for ACE. It is Access to Care Equitably, and it is specifically for individuals that are incarcerated. And the individuals that they're attempting to connect with and work, this has been a relatively recent setup, are individuals that are below that criteria for the jail behavioral health, for Lifeline Connection services, if that makes sense. Individuals that are struggling with behavioral health issues. The key and point here is that the Lake Whatcom Center staff can go into the jail. They can complete mental health assessments that avails them to services that Lake Whatcom Center provides. And I think that everybody's pretty familiar with that, housing and prescriber services and et cetera. And so they're beginning to pick up, additional pieces of that. We could use more, but my point being that those are the two sources that are available within the jail at this point in time. I think I answered the question. I hope I did. I'll stop.
I want to break the line just to say that we met with them, and I mean, their capacity is extraordinarily low. They've had one person go through that program, and it's maybe their goal was maybe one a week, but that was the goal. They hadn't even attained that, and I don't think they were. So I would just say that, yay, great, but it's minuscule in response to the need.
Thank you. Stephen and Caleb, I'm not quite sure who was first.
Okay, I'll go. I really am not completely comfortable being a naysayer here, but I just have to note that we have a $12 million facility that we spent a long time placing in the right place in the sequential intercept model as a diversion program. We did a lot of careful planning. We're operating. It's not working. And our conversation is drifting over to another point on the sequential intercept model that isn't the problem of the Ann Deacon Center not working. I really think we need to focus on getting that working, and I guess I'll just stop there and trying to refocus us. I think that I don't know when the lease runs out, but I think the lease terms need to be renegotiated and give us more control over what the services are there, besides the RCWs and the WACs. I think we need to plan on filling a lot. There are numerous gaps we've identified just in this 45 minutes that people fall through. And I think we need to plan to put resources creatively and in a targeted way on those gaps so that we don't have them. And I think we need to concentrate less on what the provider's needs are and what the health department's capabilities are at the moment, and more on the feedback that we're getting from EMS and law enforcement that this is not meeting their needs, and therefore it's not serving the diversion purposes that we wanted the center to serve, and that needs to be what we're responding to.
Thank you, Stephen. Caleb, any more comments on?
Not sure what I was going to say was instructive, especially in light of what Stephen is kind of refocusing on. But I think maybe it needs to be mentioned anyway. So this isn't really going to help in this overall discussion, but we've got to kind of keep in mind that there are specific individuals who don't meet the criteria for admission to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope, but do meet the criteria for admission to jail, but may have co-occurring issues, right? They might have behavioral health issues, they might have suicidality, but they also may be violent. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain that threshold for violence is fairly low at the Ann Deacon Center for Hope. And so there are a number of cases that we see specifically here in the jail that are never going to be diverted, at least in the current state of crisis that a person's in, but they're not necessarily appropriate for jail either. Yes, they've committed a crime, but we need something different, a different option, a different door available for those folks who are, perhaps low-level misdemeanors or felonies, but also violent, right? So we've got people with some either violent history or current violent behavior. Those folks are the ones that when you ask me, hey, are these folks going to the Ann Deacon Center for Hope earlier? This is what I'm thinking. I'm going, no, that they're not appropriate for that. And my concern is that we lose sight of that whenever we talk about places that people can go. The options for those folks are jail, the street, and sometimes if there's a bed at the hospital, and only sometimes. And that's the way I understand it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we've got to have a solution for those folks as well.
Thank you so much, Caleb. I'm going to turn this over to Perry. I have to step away for about 60 seconds, but I will be right back and continue on.
One of the things that I guess a couple of thoughts here. I threw together some very quickly some data that I collect from Compass Health and Pioneer Human Services in regard to the facility. Compass Health bed utilization. So we have 16 beds. I think everybody's kind of familiar with that. And their bed utilization from January through September has been just about 65%, 64 point. I think it was 4 or 5. Which is not good bed utilization. I say that for so they've had 34 referrals from law enforcement at this point, a total of 1,234 referrals this year thus far, and the hospital has actually been 297 of those referrals. So the hospital is a pretty significant referent as well. And I say that, in terms of utilization, bed utilization, availability, because when I talk about Pioneer Human Services, the withdrawal management services, they're at a 77, a near 78% utilization. So I don't know that I would fully agree with Stephen, although you weren't, specifying that it's not working. I think that we have, as a matter of fact, from my perspective, I think we are nearing capacity with Pioneer Human Services detox, because I don't believe we're probably realistically going to exceed much past 80%. It just, admissions, discharges, the various things. We're not going to, be at an 80%. And, again, that's my perspective. Their law enforcement referrals thus far in the year have been 29. They've had a total of 2016 referrals from January through September. But I absolutely agree, Stephen, and maybe this is just more specific in terms of what it's saying is it's not working relative to law enforcement and other first responders utilizing the facility. And I really agree with that. It's been interesting, long memories. I've communicated with some law enforcement, just asked them, how come you're not, you don't use this? And it's like, oh, they never take anybody, or, et cetera. It wasn't necessarily the drop-off time, but it's like, now they don't admit people. And I discovered in one discussion anyway, that the individual was making reference to the previous triage center and had not, just been knowledgeable about the changes that have been made. So I think one really important step is going to be this communication with law enforcement relative to, there's a special process that you can use. You can call, you can get clearance for there is a bed, and you're a priority as far as the providers are concerned, and that actual utilization, so the word gets out. My concern is that it's very possible that one bad experience will taint that process, but I don't know that I necessarily have control over that particular piece. But I've been in communication with Chief Tank, as well as Whatcom County Sheriff's Office and Bellingham Police Department, setting up meetings with. I had actually requested, and they so far, have granted, that I actually get to meet with the shift sergeants, because they are boots on the ground a lot of times, and not excluding obviously the upper structure, but I think that that's going to be a pretty important piece as well. So I just wanted to, to offer that perspective as well. There's definitely some improvement that can happen. I'm seeing that more relative to mental health triage than I am with detox. And, I'm hoping that we don't sort of exceed that capacity limit with any great consistency, because it's going to affect willingness to use it. Because every time we call, they're full. Well, that's, sort of being a victim of your own success, if you will. That reaching that true capacity and et cetera, coincides with our 23-hour crisis relief center, as well, sort of taking some of that capacity off. But I don't want to get too far out there. So just wanted to offer that perspective.
Perry, that's really helpful in response to my comments. I appreciate that. I wonder, we've been having these conversations without us holding on to the data you just cited. Is it possible for you to circulate those kinds of reports, at least to this group? I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that on an ongoing basis.
Absolutely. I collect them monthly, and it summarizes it in an Excel sheet, basically, kind of piece. So more than happy to provide that with to Jill, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And I'll revise one of my earlier tirades that the maybe the educational piece can be useful in addressing that long-term mistaken memory. At the same time, we know Mike Hilly is informed. He's not thinking about the triage center. He's thinking about Ann Deacon Center, and he's still coming to the same conclusion. So that I don't want to have people say, "Oh, I have an old memory here. It's different now," when it's not different. So
you're absolutely correct, and I think that my experience so far has honestly been that that's been the exception as opposed to the rule. But it did make me wonder how many, conceivably law enforcement professionals are out there that are holding the same opinion because they've had an experience and said, yeah, not going to do that, anymore. And I would honestly understand that. But that's about communication as well.
And I certainly think that's something that we need to reinforce and support. So thanks, Perry.
Thank you all for the wealth of information that's been provided today. I guess going back to the very beginning of our meeting, we discussed survey, and I kind of felt like there was a lot of people that didn't know that that would actually be successful. So if you guys still think we should go through with some type of survey, please let me know and we'll try to come up with questions. If not, then I would suggest that maybe we get reports from Perry on a quarterly basis on communication or group meetings that you've had with law enforcement, first responders, on things that are working, things that aren't working. And I would love to see or be able to assist in any way to promote getting transportation for individuals around the clock rather than just that Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, 9 to 5. Is there any other comments or thoughts on this? And Perry?
If I can, just what I've sort of gathered in steps that I'm absolutely involved in now, but willing to take, and just kind of a summary is we have printed the visor cards, as I mentioned, and issued those. I've got more of those just in case, that allows law enforcement to go through that quick process of, I'm going to call, I'm going to make sure there's a bed. They're going to tell me to bring the person in. They're ready for them. To lessen that time law enforcement spends there. Also communicating further about this behavioral health aid and transportation. It isn't a full answer, but I think that it's an answer. And underneath that one, I suspect, reviewing flex funds for the providers so that they could also have transportation at times that behavioral health aid isn't available, or it's a time frame, and et cetera. And then finally, the data piece, providing that. I also have I chair the Crisis Stabilization Center IPRTF subcommittee, and we'll, of course, share that information in addition to other components. I believe it's on the 19th. I don't have it right in front of me. So just wanted to summarize what's there for me in my notes at this point.
Thank you.
Perry, would there also be ways to squeeze the providers, maybe Compass Health more, I don't know where the line is. If they could process somebody in 15 minutes, does that make the equation for Chief Tank's officer taking the travel time to come in, does that make it better? Or I don't know. And just put some pressure on them to diminish that processing time?
Absolutely. The expectation is 15 minutes or less at this point in time. I've also heard sort of other numbers be thrown around. But I think that these factors, and particularly the transportation, because again, if the law enforcement professional can't give them information and they have transportation, if an admission is not possible, there's no reason to stay more than 5 minutes. Walking the person in the door, there's just not a good reason from my perspective. So I don't want to set myself up for an unattainable goal, but certainly less than 15 minutes is reasonable in my opinion. And I don't think it requires pressure. I honestly think it requires system in them understanding that this is not your transportation for the person to, be taken someplace else. We have an alternative there and can work with that.
Thank you all. We're at 12:30, so we're kind of running out of time. I got the other business. I had Jill send out an email on the DJA Alternative Pretrial Services Task Force that Tank and I are on. I think I'm just gonna save that for a later date, or Tank and I might be able to discuss that more at this next steering committee meeting as other business if time allows. But I wanted to see if there's any other business from anybody else that's here today that needs to be mentioned. Seeing none, I'm going to move to Jill and ask her if she can check the audience to see if anybody wants to speak.
Yes, thank you, Raylene. We do have an attendee who has his hand raised. Jason, go ahead.
Hi, folks. Jason Forth, local business center. Just wanted to say a couple things. Chief Tanksley, thank you for saying what you did about police training. And really, those folks, the first responders, the first ones there, they just need to slow down. I understand that their shifts are long, that they may be getting off soon, that kind of thing. But it's those few extra minutes that can really make a difference. And slowing everything down and just stepping back, stepping away, giving space to the person and the problem can really help the situation. So making someone feel rushed because the police officer's on a schedule, he's paid to be there, and I'm happy to give him extra if he wants it to stay there with that person. I'd be happy to pay him double time to do it. So whatever we need to do to make that possible, that's really what we need to do. As far as admissibility for people to these places, each situation is so different. It has to be the officers slowing down and saying, here's a list of the things that can go to the Ann Deacon Center. Here's a list of things that have to go to the hospital. The hospital is responsible for these people by law for specific situations. If somebody's violent or dangerous, the hospital is required to take them in. If the hospital thinks someone is violent or dangerous, they're required to take those people and get them away from everybody else and help them not be violent. So we really need to put a lot of more pressure on the hospital to take responsibility for their part in this. I think for too long, they've pushed it away. I'm not sure if anyone here has seen the emergency room t-shirt that has the AK-47, the needle, and I forget what else it is. It's a knife. But essentially, it's an emergency room t-shirt that shows a military insignia for fighting drug use. If you don't look at that and say, wait a minute, what's going on there? Why does this hospital have a military insignia with guns, knives, and a needle? It's the perception of what they're fighting and how they're fighting it as opposed to helping. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. And I don't have any other attendees with us today.
Right. I appreciate everybody participating in today's legal and justice meeting. If there's any other comments or things that you would like to see in the future, please let myself or Jill or Arlene know, and we'd be happy to assist and try to make it happen. Have a great day.